Welcome to the Underground Strategy Podcast. My name is Max, and in our last episode, Evert broke down the spy games of Rooseboom and the Radley couple and their intelligence activities in South Africa during the Second World War. But today we're turning to a man with a much better spy name, or actually men. South Africa's spy history has featured two shady figures named Felix. But today we are talking about the OG Felix, of course. The one you, Evert, described in your book as one of the greatest thorns in the side of British intelligence in South Africa. So, welcome back to the show, and since you're basically a regular by now, we are going to jump straight into it. Who was Felix?
Yeah, thanks again, Max and Tony. It's always a pleasure talking military history with you guys. So, who was Felix? Well, to pick up where we sort of left off on the previous podcast, we know with the Radleys that the Germans had tried to reach out to the South African opposition, principally the National Party, but each time it was sort of intercepted by the Ossewabrandwag. And then when Rooseboom came onto the picture, he was the conduit through which the Ossewabrandwag established contact with Germany. And he operated a rudimentary spy ring or organization, intelligence organization that functioned sort of between 1940 and 1941. Until such time that there was a fallout between Rooseboom and the Ossewabrandwag. And it mainly had to do with the Ossewabrandwag having or wanting full control over the transmissions to Germany, and Rooseboom having to use a third party was sort of a sticky point for them. So that opened the show now for a new spy to arrive on the scene. And without going into his whole story, Lothar Sittig, codenamed Felix, he was a German national. He's trained in the Foreign Service. He worked in Angola before the war. He worked in South Africa before the war on the farms as a farm manager. And of course, when the war breaks out in September 1939, Sittig, like most foreign enemy nationals, gets interned. He gets interned at the Leeukop internment camp. Of course, it's not a nice place to be, and he's able to escape from the camp along with one of his compatriots, Niels Olaf Pasch, and they make it down to Cape Town, and eventually somewhere they let it slip that they want to make their way back to Mozambique, to Portuguese East Africa, because they want to ultimately get back to Germany and join the German war effort. So they are put into contact with the Ossewabrandwag or members of the Ossewabrandwag, who then promises to smuggle them all the way to the border between South Africa and Portuguese East Africa, and they make it into Maputo, Lorenzo Marx, and they put into contact with the German consul, and of course then that facilitates their introduction into the Trompke network, which was the big German intelligence organization operating in the territory. So this all occurred basically at the time that the fallout between Hans Rooseboom and the Ossewabrandwag was happening. So the German consul, well, not Paul Trompke himself, but Leuthold Wertz, who was running the Trompke organization, ultimately then dispatched Lothar Sittig, Felix, to South Africa to now act as the main intermediary between the Trompke network in Portuguese East Africa and the Ossewabrandwag. And one of his explicit goals was then to help facilitate them or help them establish direct communication with Berlin to be able to send intelligence onwards to Germany for action. So that's sort of short and sweet who Sittig is and how he comes about, how he arrives on the scene. It's far more detailed in my book. It's actually quite interesting. His escape attempts, the journey into Portuguese East Africa, very, very detailed. And of course, then making his way back into South Africa, being captured again, being interned again, and escaping, and then finally sort of rocking up at the door of Hans van Rensburg and giving this sort of code word that would establish his credentials. And then van Rensburg knew, well, this guy was dispatched by Leuthold Wertz, and he was our man. He was going to be the man for the German intelligence networks.
I'm just wondering, Evert, on that one, he comes and so he goes up to modern Maputo and he meets with the Trompke network. How does he establish this trust? Because I'm thinking in this world of intelligence, it could be anyone, and it could be pretty dangerous. Or was it just his credentials from the past?
I don't think it's as much his credentials from the past. I think look, when he arrived in Lorenzo Marx, he obviously indicated that he wanted to go back to Germany to join the war effort, and he wanted to have an active role in the war. So I don't know whether that might have been an indication to Wärts that, listen here, this guy doesn't just want to while away his time in Lorenzo Marx playing football on the beach with visiting sailors. He actually wants to do something. And that might have been, I think, where he saw that I could potentially use this guy. And of course, Sittig knew South Africa. He spoke Afrikaans. He already had some connections within the rural countryside. So I think he was they realized that this could be the guy that would facilitate them establishing a direct link with Ossewabrandwag.
Talking about direct links, we can't, of course, establish one to Felix himself, but thanks to Evert and the archives, we do have a short clip of his voice. Let's take a listen.
To say verhalen searching. En om dat te doen, wil die constable van maken zijn revolver wegzetten. En die revolver gaan af. Schutten. Maar ik had in die ogen van Kruidvijf gekeken. En in die opening van die geweer. Ik heb nooit. Nee. Want iemand heeft het gezien, maar ik heb het niet gezien. Maar ik kon in die ogen van die sergeant, wat net naar mij gekeken, kon ik zien, hij denkt, ik heb iets gedaan. Maar hij heeft zijn kop gehad. En ik keek om en zei, wat daar, kom erin liggen. Sorry sir. Je schudt het net langs zijn schoen in de grond. Ik mag naar hier tussen komen.
And that was Felix, decades after the war, still on tape. And as always, thanks to the Records, Archives and Museum Division of Northwest University. And of course, the Ossewabrandwag Archival Collection for letting us share this treasure. So to loop back to the earlier discussion, I was thinking, what kind of effect are we talking about in the framework of this network? I mean, with the Radley couple, it was still a fairly limited operation. But with Felix, how effective was his network? What level was he operating at by this point?
It's a good question, Max. I think before I get to sort of the impact or how good it was or how effective it was, I think what is important to understand with this Felix organization or the Felix network is that it takes a while. It takes a number of months for them to build a new wireless transmitter, to get the required crystals that's smuggled in from Portuguese East Africa so that they can transmit on certain frequencies. And then with the help of the Ossewabrandwag, they actually start building a transmitter near Freiburg in the old Western Transvaal, from where they could start transmitting. Initially, they transmitted directly to Lorenzo Marx, so they would just waylay intelligence to Lorenzo Marx, and then ultimately there it would be decided what would get sent on to Germany. But what they really wanted to do, the Ossewabrandwag especially, is to have this direct link with Germany, with Berlin. And this is what Felix helped them to do. So he didn't have the technical know-how himself. He relied a lot on the various members of the Ossewabrandwag that were sympathetic to the cause. They went and they stole a whole bunch of instruments from hospitals and all over the show that they would need to build this transmitter. And they succeeded. In 1942, they do succeed to establish direct two-way communication with Berlin, which is, of course, great. So now they have a direct link to Germany, and they can feed intelligence directly to the German Foreign Office or the Abwehr, depending on where it's supposed to go. So how effective were they? I think one has to sort of divide the intelligence into two. There was, of course, political intelligence that they were reporting on. And then there was sort of the military and the naval intelligence. But if we first just hang and talk a bit about the political intelligence, these were mainly speeches. I mean, so it wasn't really too much intelligence. It was mainly speeches from Hans van Rensburg that was no longer published in newspapers. He was banned, or those of our Ossewabrandwag, they were banned from publishing his speeches in the newspapers. So sometimes it was basically just propaganda, like blatant propaganda being sent to Germany that would then be broadcasted over the shortwave radio station, Radio Zeesen, back to South Africa. Other political intelligence was mainly gleaned from newspapers. So it was OSINT, open source intelligence. It wasn't anything really like damning that would have come out of the cabinet or anything like that. So yes, I don't think the value of the political intelligence wasn't war winning, or it wasn't really going to threaten the Allied war effort in the end. The naval and military intelligence, I think it's interesting as well. Sittig never goes and he never overestimates, I think, his importance, as what Rooseboom did. Rooseboom, remember, he said, no, he was responsible for the sinking of so many Allied vessels and blah, blah, blah. Sittig never says that, but it's interesting when you look at some of the primary sources that some of the stuff that he does report on is quite questionable. So naval intelligence, it was still pretty much the same way, or the modus operandi that Rooseboom used. It was informers at the various ports in South Africa and the harbors that would then report on ship movements, where convoys were traveling to, and this would then be passed back up to Sittig, and he would report it to Berlin. So the turnaround time, for example, if you had to collect intelligence on the coast in Cape Town, it had to travel up by rail all the way to Pretoria, it had to be dispatched to Freiburg, and then it would have to be broadcast to Berlin, and Berlin would have to pass it on to the Naval High Command, and they would have to pass it on to the Submarine High Command, and that would have to be, sort of sent back to the U-boats. You're talking about days, if not up to a week. So a lot could have happened in the space of that week. A vessel that might have left Cape Town that very first day that this information was collected could already have traveled several hundred miles in many different directions. So if you consider that, then sometimes it was negligible. But if you look at the tide of the naval war, it had also turned. By the early part of 1943 into 1944, South Africa was no longer an active operational theatre for German U-boats. So questionable, yes, maybe there was some of the information that was successful, but we don't know the full extent thereof. The military intelligence, it was intelligence being passed along, for example, of a possible body of South African troops moving to one or another theatre. So yes, it was intelligence, but whether that would change the war, debatable. They also, the one example I have is where Sittig reports on the potato consumption of one South African military base, one camp in South Africa. How many potatoes they consumed in a month. So I don't really know what the Nazis would do with that, but they knew how much potatoes the South Africans liked to eat in a month. So whether they had it boiled or for chips or, whatever, mash, I guess they could entertain themselves with that. So I think different levels in terms of the efficiency, but ultimately, did it have a strategic impact and did it turn the tide of the war? I think no. I think that the tide of the war had turned already against Germany by the end of 42 and the beginning of 43. And this was like the Hardy Boys, they were I think they were having a great big old adventure, but I don't know. I would question the value thereof in the end.
I just want to come back to that. We discussed it previously. There's a bit of sometimes a mystique, around this whole espionage game. And many times spies after the fact, or, especially the ones that write the history after the fact, or they'll try to paint it in the best light, who wouldn't. But in your book, you're saying Sittig, he claims that he had access to one of his agents who was close to Jan Smuts. And I think this is an interesting part, just in what you were saying now, like how much actually transpired from that, maybe, we don't know, maybe he just brought in the tea, to the local, that was his job. I don't know what his job was, but, what do you think?
So, it's a known fact that parts of the Defence Force and parts of the police in South Africa were known members of the Ossewabrandwag. Well, they were anti-war, many of them, and thus they didn't sign the Africa Service Oath or the General Service Oath to go serve beyond South Africa's borders. So if there was somebody close to Smuts, it might have been a bodyguard or a trooper on guard at the gate at his house. I don't know if it was much more than that. I don't think it was anything more sinister. I think you're right. I think sometimes these guys inflate the importance of their own networks because they have to sort of justify their own existence sometimes. So what Sittig was quite good at, you've got to give it to him. He constantly tried to engage and improve his organization. At once, he made suggestions that he should be allowed to communicate directly with the U-boats operating in South African waters. And for a certain period, the Germans actually entertained this. And they were actually willing to go as far as they partly organized a clandestine meeting where there would be an exchange of material and also of a Ossewabrandwag member that would be then taken back to Germany to act as the sort of nodal point for the organization in Germany, directly with the Nazis. By name, Heimer Anderson, who was Hans von Rensburg's adjutant. That thing was planned for. I got it. The Allies intercepted it. They had the dates and the times of the meeting. They were ready to pounce on them. I found this location as well. I happened to find it, there's some random trig beacon close to Jeffreys Bay where they were going to do this sort of exchange. So Sittig tried to. Ultimately, it didn't happen. I think the Germans were also not, too keen on having this. Even if he was a German agent, but having their agents speak directly to the U-boats, I can't imagine Germans doing something like that. Like, it just doesn't fit the picture of efficiency and organization that sort of assume the German armed forces have. So, yeah, but anyway, so Sittig tried to. He really did try to increase his value, but I think he was hamstrung by the environment, the politics of the day. He could only transmit the intelligence that was given to him. So it was in a certain way the same as Rooseboom. That was also what frustrated Rooseboom. He could only transmit what was given to him. And the Ossewabrandwag still controlled that, ultimately.
If you're dialed in, drop us a review on your app. Watching on YouTube, hit subscribe to join the conversation. All right, back to it. What always strikes me is how determined some of these Ossewabrandwag guys seems to be when it comes to building a direct line to Germany. Say what you want about them, but they definitely had the drive and the commitment. But I was thinking, are we only talking about intelligence here, or was there also some form of direct action, like sabotage maybe, that was organized within the Felix network?
So within the ranks of the Felix network itself, not really, no sabotage. But there were bigger acts of sabotage that were associated with the Ossewabrandwag. And there are some odd indications that the German Brandenburgers, which is some special forces unit of the German armed forces, were operating as well, or elements thereof were possibly operating around South Africa. So the Ossewabrandwag launched a number of sabotage attempts across the Union of South Africa. They bombed post offices, they cut down telephone poles, the telegraph poles, they even tried to bomb some harbour installations in Durban. Did it change the war effort? No. Was it a nuisance? Yes, absolutely. They robbed some banks and stuff to fuel their own organization. But yeah, I think in a way South Africa was too distant for some major sabotage, attempts to actually take place. They were just too far away for Germany to be able to really dispatch, a large number of agents that could really, really throw the South African war effort into disarray.
I'm still getting, that's absolutely fair. I'm just still getting to this point about, Agent Felix acting as the spotter, for the submarines, if to put it in very basic terms, you can just imagine him, on, at Sea Point, like, left, I said left, I just, come on, man. You're like, you know what I mean? Like the practicality of that, like in actual, you know what I mean? Like just tactically, how would that have, I'm not saying, of course he claimed that, I'm not doubting it, but just if you think about the nuts and bolts, right?
Yeah, like semaphore flags or something like, going left, go left. No, it's of course the practicality, but that's the beauty of hindsight. It is 2020. We can sort of look at these things more critically. But, like in the spur of the moment when these things are happening and, the adrenaline's pumping, or you're sitting around somewhere and you're bored and you have to sort of think of something to justify your existence, I think you come up with some crazy ideas.
I must say, I do think there was a couple of brandies involved, before we came up with that. Like
yeah, absolutely.
But jokes aside, you mentioned the kind of strategic, the operational intelligence part, but then there was also and I think years with the Ossewabrandwag played a good game, right? And it's how they tried to influence that right-wing part of South African society. And I think that came through, whether it's that or through radio communications, etc., right?
So I think, if you look at the long game and the short game, by the end of the war, we know the Allies won the war. The Felix organization basically ceased to operate, I think, by March or April 1944, somewhere there, maybe a bit later. The war was basically, it was a rearguard action by the Germans for the inevitable final invasion of Germany. So yeah, not much happened. But if you look at it in a bit longer, or the midterm to long term, I think the galvanization of support, or Afrikaner support, even though it didn't translate directly anymore to the Ossewabrandwag, but by 1948, of course, the National Party wins the election and the Afrikaners come to power, and they sort of achieve that they basically set out to do several years before. So one can maybe argue in the long term that the effects of the sort of Ossewabrandwag resistance, even if it was only cultural and maybe political and not much military or activistic in that sense, in the long run, they might have been quite successful in helping to galvanize Afrikaner support against the war, against Smuts, against the United Party. And even if the National Party in the end was then the beneficiary thereof, it was in some way effective. But the Ossewabrandwag as a movement by the early 1950s ceases to exist altogether. And what I think is a good legacy of theirs is actually the fact that they then realized that they had to do something about the legacy and the memory of the organization. So they had meetings. They talked about collecting all the archival documents, creating a special archive at the Old Potchefstroom University for Christian higher education. They appointed archivists and historians that went out, that interviewed, Sittig, Rooseboom, a whole plethora of people that served in the organization, from generals to foot soldiers to women to young men, young daughters, young girls, anybody that was involved in the organization. And the legacy of that organization is the fact that there's a very, very, very substantial archive that is very good and very detailed that exists today. And that has allowed me to write my part of the intelligence wall, but that allows many different other students and researchers to write various aspects of South Africa's Second World War history. And, there's just so much of it that's still being done. Tony, you met some of these youngsters working on this, but, there's Sune van Achtenberg. She's working on propaganda, morale within the organization, and the idea of patriotism within the movement, patriotism for the folk or the nation, and patriotism or, not being patriotic against your country. There's Charles Blichnout, who works on the Ossewabrandwag. There's Anna Legrandsie, who's done amazing work on the internment of Ossewabrandwag members in the Second World War. And so it goes forth. Every now and again, there's a new student. There's actually a student doing a master's now on the history of the Ossewabrandwag archive. So, anyway, I would say I think in the long run, they were quite successful. If we are still writing about them and we're still talking about them 70 years after they ceased to exist,
Yeah, definitely. We cannot deny that. And when you were talking about the archive and that kind of long-term legacy, I started thinking about the Allies. How much did they actually know about all this? I mean, how well documented were these German spy networks from their side?
It's a good one again. So what was great, and you pick it up in the MI5 archives at the National Archive of the UK, they've got a file on every German agent that operated, and the files on Rooseboom and Sittig are particularly interesting, but they've also got big files on Hans van Rensburg, the leader of the Ossewabrandwag. They've got big files on the Ossewabrandwag itself as a movement. So once you start scanning through those, you just realize that the British had such a complete picture of what was happening. And partly why they were able to do this is they had broken the codes or the cipher. Basically, by the time that Rooseboom got kicked out and Sittig took over, they were in on the game. And every time that the Germans and Sittig, where they were communicating about changing the code, the Allies were just in the loop, and they would just know that they were changing from the Rose code to the basic method or whatever. And they had the complete picture. So, of course, when the Enigma code was broken eventually and some of the other ciphers were broken, they would then copy all of this illicit transmissions in South Africa. They would send it off to the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park in the UK. They would then be able to read the illicit transmissions and decipher it and put it into plain language. And this was, of course, all used to build a dossier against these spies, or it just built files and files against them. So we have a pretty complete picture of both the Rooseboom and the Felix organizations just because of the amount of documents that was captured by the British. So it's amazing.
And I want to build on that one, on this idea of what the intelligence networks knew. But there's a fascinating part where we find some of these figures later on linked to Southern Africa, and it's not necessarily to do with your book only, but, like Alexander Scotland with the London Cage, the MI9 facility. And he had links to Smuts, I think, Ian and I brought it up briefly in our book. I found it, in some of these, but in secondary sources. And now Smuts had given him a way in, and he becomes part of the bigger intelligence community. I think it still has to be written, but Jan Smuts, as Prime Minister at the time, he had a lot of links to this intelligence community. So I have no doubt, just on your point, that he knew exactly what, besides just the local informants, right? That he knew exactly what was happening in South African society.
Yeah. So, he did. He was briefed, especially if you consider the post-war period when they now started the hunt for the South African traitors that was guilty of treason or treasonous crimes during the war. Yeah, no, Smuts had he was in the loop, he knew exactly what was what. But it also comes out that the Ossewabrandwag and these German organizations were like a nuisance, like a tolerable nuisance. So I think Smuts knew that in the grander scheme of things, the value of what they were doing were negligible. It was like better the devil you know than the one you don't. So they were sort of like tolerated. They were able to read everything that was being sent. So they knew exactly what was what. So the interesting thing is, and it's also not a sad part, but it's a missing part of the history, is the Barrett report that was then compiled at the end of the war, that was basically the basis of a high treason case that was being built against Hans van Rensburg. And it detailed the entire German intelligence network that operated in South Africa, principally in South Africa. It also, of course, covered Mozambique, Portuguese East Africa. Very detailed. It basically confirmed everything that I had managed to glean from secondary sources and, of course, from the wealth of primary sources that's out there. But what was missing was the appendices. And the appendices to this document were the intercepted transmissions. So if one is able to track it down, because it must be somewhere. If it's not, then it might have been destroyed. If one could get your hands on that, you'd be able to really see, to really judge the strategic effect or the value of these transmissions. And to quickly say, whether this was just for propaganda purposes, whether it was political purposes, or whether there was actually some military or naval value to what they were doing. Because you'd be able to tie it into, sinkings or events or the deployments of troops. So yeah, I think there's still room to maneuver, still work to be done. It's not for me. I think, it's sort of one of those things that one moves past. Got a master student now who's going to, as I think I've mentioned before, start work on the Trompke network, because I think that's one cog of the story that still needs to be unpacked a little bit bigger, the German organization and Lorenzo Marx and how they function and what they did. But it definitely is a part of our history. There's still many facets to explore around this intelligence war.
I got a question, and maybe I missed something before, but since a lot of these German operations originated from what is now Mozambique, that was under Portuguese control during the war, and they were officially neutral, right? And I think their main guy at the time, José Frederico Marques, if I remember correctly, leaned a bit towards the pro-German side. So I guess that gave these spy networks some freedom to operate. But is it fair to say that Allied intelligence like MI5 or SOE, etc., was weaker in Mozambique than in South Africa at the time?
Yeah, well, of course, South Africa, part of the Commonwealth, it was a lot easier for them to operate in our territory. But there definitely were elements of the Special Operations Executive, SOE, and MI6 that were active in Mozambique. And there were a couple of occasions where, of course, they reported on what was happening there. Malcolm Muggeridge, one of the officers, wrote that Lorenzo Marx was as lively as a flea circus in terms of referring to the intelligence action that was taking place there, because it was neutral. So you had the German network there, you had the Italians, there was apparently a Japanese network also operating, and some various other iterations. And then, of course, you had the allies that were also there. On a couple of occasions, there were some counterintelligence operations. There was a honey trap that was used quite successfully, where they managed to, it was one of the German spies, I think, I forget his name now, lured him in with a honey trap, knocked the dude out, put him in the back of a car, drove him across the border into Swaziland, which was already part of the British Empire. And they managed to then deal with him. So yes, but the counterintelligence itself, that's also an aspect that requires a bit further work. Dr. Kent Fedorowicz has done some work, very, very dated, but there are some elements of the counterintelligence war that's also out there.
That is pretty solid. And I mean, counterintelligence is one of those areas that usually gets less attention, since historians tend to focus more on the intelligence side of things usually. But yeah, before we wrap up, what actually happened to Felix? You touched on it earlier, but can we go back to that for a moment? What became of him and his network?
By the end of the war, especially when he sort of goes off of the radar, and when this sort of hunt for South African traitors or whatever, of people that were involved in treasonous activity starts, he sort of goes into hiding. But then he resurfaces again after 1948. So in 1948, the National Party pardons everybody that was found guilty of treason, principally like Robbie Leibrand, who was sentenced to death. While under Smith, he was already commuted to life imprisonment instead of the death sentence. But he's released, and any other person that was charged with treason and found guilty is released. And of course, the case against Ossewabrandwag and the people that aided them was also dropped. And then, Sittig sort of resurfaces again. I think he ends up in Bloemfontein, if I don't, at least the correspondence in the Ossewabrandwag archive, when they corresponded with him, he was in Bloemfontein. He was apparently a businessman of sorts. There's some photos in the archive of where he visits Hans van Rensburg and Heimer Anderson after the war, when they were a bit older, just having a nice little Saturday afternoon barbecue. So that's around. And then of course they managed to interview him, and he wrote up at least 2 accounts of his time as a German agent, which is of course very valuable, from the horse's mouth, sort of, so to speak. And then, quite interestingly, I was contacted by his, I don't know, what would it be? His great granddaughter, a couple of years ago. And she didn't want to shout at me or attack me or anything. So I think I gave a balanced portrayal of the guy. There was no malicious intent when one writes these sort of things. But you never know how family members react, sort of, when you put the information out there, about their grandfathers or their fathers. So yeah, other than that, I don't know too much about what happened to him afterwards.
No, I think that's a good summary, Evert. At that time, I'm just thinking about, you mentioned Smuts commuting the sentences and all that. I think he had a different experience back then anyway. He had maybe learned his lesson from harsh actions in, back in the rebellion.
Yeah, from Yuppie. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's that one. He was still bearing the brunt of that. But no, that thank you so much for joining us today and for continuing this discussion about the intelligence war in South Africa during the Second World War. It really was great. And I believe the next one for our listeners will be focusing on counterintelligence, just to wrap up this whole saga. And then, of course, Evert, we have much more to discuss. But once again, a big thank you from everyone at Underground Strategy.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Thanks, Max.
Thank you so much, Evert. And yes, we still got a few corners of this story left to uncover. Looking forward to digging into the counterintelligence side next time. And to everyone listening, cheers for sticking with us. You know where to find us. And just for the record, no spies were harmed in the making of this episode, as far as we know. So we will see you in the next one. You have a great one, and bye-bye.